The first question we ask is whether there is fundamentally a new reality dawning in our time. From childhood on, we experience that reality is something that grows within us. But we've come into a civilization where people generally are pretty dogmatic about the real world. And for most people now, the real world means the common sense world, which everybody, in inverted commas, accepts as being the reality, the reality. And we're taught, almost from our mother's knee, that in the last century and a half, that reality has become more and more of a certainty, has been more and more the subject of incontrovertible proof that science knows things. And we're not, on the whole, very much encouraged to look at that word know in any other sense than that which we experience through our senses. We use the senses as the basis for inquiry, and we think with our brains, and we arrive at a picture of what science, in inverted commas again, calls proof of the incontrovertible fact. Now, scientists themselves are not on such sure ground as that, although there's a consensus. But there are many, many scientists, and some of those who are at the forefront, the cutting edge of the increase of scientific knowledge, are not nearly on such sure ground as that. And on the whole, physics, especially during the last 30 or 40 years, has been coming up with concepts, pictures of the universe, which by no means leave the ordinary human being feeling that they know what is real. The whole picture of physics, atomic physics, going beyond the atom into smaller and smaller particles, even the concept of size of particles becomes unsure ground. The nature of the starry universe appears to alter every year or two with new concepts that arise. So, although ordinary people who don't inquire very deeply into that, read about it in the papers or are educated in it, some to a very considerable depth, still accept in principle that there is a real objective world. And slowly, without people noticing it, this scientific background to life has become a belief system rather than a system of knowledge. We can start to talk about science and about something we can call scientism, something which we may have inquired into at some stage of our development, but which more and more sinks back into what is taken for granted as secure knowledge. Science knows this, science knows that. But we only have to go a little way into that whole realm to discover that knowing is not a thing that exists there outside our own consciousness. Knowing is something that individual human beings do. And knowledge is not something that comes towards you, in Immanuel Kant's terms, as a thing in itself. He used this expression, Ding an sich, over and over again in his philosophy. And he believed himself to have established that there was a realm of reality to which human consciousness could never actually have access. It existed in a realm where it was inaccessible to inner experience. It existed out there. Tables and chairs, immutable in a certain way. On one level, it's quite obvious that that isn't true. A table is not a thing, it's a process. It's something that came into existence, say, 100 years ago, perhaps less if the trees out of which it was made were very quick-growing ones, and in another variable time, through accident, through breaking up, through fire or whatever, it will cease to exist. It isn't a stable thing in itself. The thingness of a table is projected onto it by us. It's a process. It's part of the process of the world. And looking at reality from that kind of point of view is an extremely uncomfortable process. It literally takes the very ground from under our feet, as far as security is concerned, of what we think is real. It's all very provisional. Now, in some realms of our feeling, part of our feeling, we do know this very well, and it gives us a feeling of insecurity, and it's the basis for a lot of more or less unconscious fear for the greater part of our lives. We don't really know what is true to the same feeling depth as we think we do. This opens the possibility that reality itself is on the blink, is actually changing. As we change, since it is we who do the knowing, the reality that we know also is changeable. And the big question is this directional or not? Is it going anywhere? Is there a process or path in our consciousness which is leading to a greater degree of light, of enlightenment, of understanding, of penetration into the real? Or is this a purely subjective thing, which has nothing to do with reality at all? Unless we begin to face the fact that the Ding an sich concept of Kant is actually an error of observation, we can't get very far along those lines. Kant thought with such enormous power that he never observed the fact that he was thinking. He never observed the fact that his phenomenon was observable in the same way as his pipe and socks suspenders were observable. He thought, but he didn't think himself thinking. And a lot of philosophers do this. They get lost in a realm which they cease to be able to observe as an objective happening. What these great 19th century philosophers never actually came to realizing was that it was they who were doing it. They were actually doing it themselves. And if they were asked, well, who are you then? Who are you? They went back into the realm of thinking and started to describe themselves as subjective products of their own thinking, and that the actual self itself didn't exist in the sense that the questioner meant. It was simply a subjective observation of processes going on in the brain. And in what sense the perceptions they were having in their through senses and through the thinking, in what sense those were real, they didn't inquire, because they described that very largely as being itself a subjective question, a projection, a construct which had no part to play in the realities they were describing. So the beginning question of this evening about how do we find a path to a new reality needs another question that comes before it, namely, is there a reality at all? Never mind, is there a new reality, but are we talking about a path from anywhere, or is this all simply subjective construction that's going on? And the only consciousness that can get beyond that point is your own. To become convinced that thinking is something you do, not something that happens to you, is the absolute beginning point that we have to be on. And if it isn't something you do, but something that happens to you, the kind of questioning that goes beyond the immediate, obvious sense experience is meaningless, and we might as well all go home. And the only way that one can be convinced that thinking is something one does is to do it. It's almost a matter of guilt among people trained scientifically if they find themselves pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps in that kind of way. Because all the thinking which comes from thinking is something I do, I create my own reality, I create reality, full stop, leads to a serpent biting its own tail. I think I'm thinking, I think I'm thinking, and so on. Deeper and deeper into a realm which appears to have no exit. It has no exit because it is all there is. It is all that is. It is God. You are God. I am God. That's where God is. Now, what's begun to happen in the last 2 or 3 decades is that this closed world of thinking about a reality that doesn't appear to change, the stability of that unchanging reality being what we depend on, if you like, for our actual sanity, for our feeling that we are real and that we're living in a real world, has begun to change. It's begun to be invaded by other impressions, other experiences than those that in ordinary life we accept as real. Many psychologists regard this as pathological, that because of the pressures of modern life and its unnaturalness, people's inner life is breaking down and becoming unstable and needs treatment. There are many people who regard what we, perhaps, if we've gone a little further, would regard as spiritual development. There are many psychologists who regard pictures and concepts and processes of what we call a spiritual character as being pathological, as being something that is a result of tensions and strains that's making ordinary life unbearable and unacceptable. And in order to survive, we gradually come more and more to the point of having to state with more and more inner activity our own existence. I am. And if we don't find ways of stating our own existence in this way, pressure does make this experience more and more unstable. We lose the sense of our own reality and own existence in the same way as we lose the sense of the reality of the existence of the world, in inverted commas, outside us. And part of the experience of stating our own reality in that way leads us to the realization that the repudiation of this false thought that there is a world outside me to which I have no access, repudiating that is part of the process of the stating of our own identity. Our own identity includes the world of which we are aware. The world of which we are aware is us. And we communicate on that basis. There's a consensus that we all agree that there is a table in the middle of this room, unless one of us is actually hiding the fact that he's schizoid and doesn't actually experience that to be so. But generally speaking, we can assume that that consensus reality, that consensus about what is there, is common to us. What is much more difficult is to realize that it is still within us. We are within each other in that sense too. Now, in all this process, going away from the obvious, leaving behind the taken for granted common sense world, and venturing out into a new space and finding out whether it's real, in all that we are already on a path. We are already taking on board the idea that human consciousness and reality, which are part of the same thing, are not in their own nature a stable, fixed thing, but are on the blink and changing and moving, and that move is directional, and the direction of it is waking. We're waking all the time. We're waking to the new. And as we wake to new reality, it begins to take on certain features. And some of those features we also find we have in common, like tables and chairs. We're becoming something. Now this can be very frightening. We find ourselves on the edge of a precipice of reality. Reality suddenly opens up beneath our feet. Now, out of what can we restore our sense of the real once that abyss opens up beneath us? What is this abyss? It's well known to thousands of years of spiritual history. This abyss of instability that we're confronted with when we get beyond the obvious has been described in every religion, in every philosophy, in every path of human inquiry for thousands of years, referred to as the abyss, as the threshold, as the crossing of the threshold, as the path to the mysteries, as the door into the realm of the mysteries, that of which the Egyptian temples spoke, that of which the Greeks spoke, that of which the oracle at Delphi spoke. All these doors that opened up in people's consciousness, it's part of the what I've heard described as the golden universal succession of human inquiry. But in our time, it's taking a new form, because it is so that the experiences that come into people's consciousness now are different. And that difference is a new thing. There are new things happening that haven't happened in spiritual history before. People have not, for instance, become aware of a new dimension in their inner space which is a different color from the old one. We take for granted so much our sort of baseline experiences, our inner perception of color, our outer perception of color in the world, this language that goes on between our inner formation of color and our outer perception of color. This dialogue of perception is being extended. It's extending itself in many people's consciousness, actually basically in everybody's consciousness, but it takes more time for some people to become aware of it than others. And this extension is describable in color terms. It's going towards the blue end of the spectrum. More and more people are beginning to be aware that things are not so reddy brown as they were. This reddy brown green impression we have of our general world is slowly moving towards the blue violet end of the spectrum. This is an experience that many, many people have who are on an inner process of development and consciousness. There's a new blue world appearing. There's a mythology of it which is beginning to appear. People write books about it. The story of the Dogon tribe, who have been watching Sirius gradually getting nearer to us for thousands of years. who were aware of the double sun in Sirius before the scientists were, who were aware of a kind of blue reality approaching. Since they themselves are quite unintellectually involved, this African tribe, the Dogons, they can't conceptualize that. They can't think of it in the sort of terms that in Western civilization we would think of it. They simply are aware of it as an inner reality. The star is coming towards us. And when people are on paths which involve listening to an expanding train of thought which enters the quiet of one's own meditative consciousness and gives one a feeling that there is more inner space in it, and that inner space begins to be occupied by thoughts which are wider and deeper than the thoughts we're used to having in our ordinary day-to-day life. These entities who are not separate from ourselves, we're not possessed by them, they're extensions of our own being. They appear to be extensions of our own being at first. Their identity and their flavor, the taste, the character of them, this grows with practice and with use and with habitual paying attention to one's inner space in that way. These beings begin to speak quite concretely about such changes that in our own consciousness, changes in the world. Normally, if we think about a path which starts somewhere from within our own, from where we are, we think that our sense of reality requires that the reality we're being led into by that path is a stable one. It's fixed in some sort of way. Otherwise, how can we recognize it? How can we come to terms with it? How can we be sure it's real, and so on? But when you're creating your own reality from within, this criterion of a fixed reality whose lineaments you will always recognize because the same thing's in the same place each time you reapproach it, becomes different. It doesn't lose its sense of sureness at all, because instead of, okay, I walk along a path, last time I came that mountain was there, those trees were there, there was a curve to the left in the path last time I came. But on an inner path of the kind I'm describing, you made the curve to the left. So next time, in order to repeat the experience and go from there and see where it goes beyond that, you repeat the same form. You go the same way. At first, it's not a very conscious process, but gradually you become aware of the flavor, of the feeling. This is where I see that, and this is where I have that feeling, or the other feeling. You're building up what, actually Rudolf Steiner used the word hut for it. When you detach yourself from your sense-bound consciousness, you're in empty space at first, and you've got an abyss under you. But you don't drop, because you have a deep intuition that you create certain points of reference in your own inner space. And those points of reference at first are largely unconscious, but gradually you come to realize that you know where you are in your inner life. You become more confident in it. You become more at home in it. That's why he called it a hut. It feels like a home. You feel at home in a certain kind of space. And if you're listening to beings every day, as some people are, you begin to know that this is a path into a new reality. You know it's a path because you made it yourself. You built it. What did you build it out of? This is a very difficult question to form a picture of out of pure cloth, as it were. you begin to have the feeling that there is a ground, and that this ground is the earth, is where you are, and that this ground has the nature of a mother, of something that gave you birth, that gave birth to you, to which you owe your existence. This mother ground that stands beneath you is the reference point for thinking about what is the substance that I am moulding into the forms that I've created on my inner path. And the path is illuminated. It's illuminated from, in inverted commas, above, although the word above is not precise, but from another direction than the ground, put it that way. It's illuminated by what we come to call the Father element, the Father, the illuminator, that which works from outside in rather than from inside out. And between these two poles of Father light, Mother ground, we walk. Now what happens as a result? You have the feeling from the start that you are the reality that you're creating. You are God in that sense. You're the Father aspect of God. You're the Mother aspect of God. But you're also, in the course of this path, you're becoming something. You're becoming something else, something new. And this becoming is seated right at the core of your own being. And that core, that center, is what you start to describe as the heart. You're coming from the heart along this path, and you are becoming something which is in your heart. And that is what we mean when we use the word Christ. We don't start from the Christ, we become the Christ. We don't start from there. When the earth first came into existence, and we came into existence as the other half of the reality of the existence, the earth was one half of the reality, we were the other half, and we came together as active and passive, in a sense, the agent of conscious life and the sphere of action within which that conscious life took place. And from the moment we put our first step forward from the heart, the cosmic entity of awareness came into our heart space and started to grow. But it wasn't there to start with. And that being is the Christ. And the awareness of the Christ is not here 1 minute and not the next, or not here 1 minute and there it is suddenly the next. It comes up like the sun. It rises like the sun within. Which is why I put the second part of the title of the talk as the dawning of the Christ within. You become aware of the Christ within much as you become aware of the light slowly appearing in the early morning. To start with, it isn't there. And then there's a long period when you don't know whether it's there or not. And some of the time you think it isn't. And some of the time you know it is. And it's a long way along the path for most people before that sureness that the path you're on is the dawning of a new reality from within, which is the Christ and which we all actually have in common. although we're all unique, and the aspects of God that we represent are very idiosyncratic indeed. We're not being ironed out into one sort of uniform thing called humanity. We remain extremely idiosyncratic, each of us. But it's the same entity which is manifesting as an idiosyncrasy, as a unique manifestation. It's more like the picture of the hologram than anything else in physics, that at any one point in space, the whole of the realities that are possible in space can manifest. That's the principle of the hologram. And that's true of us. The whole of the divine reality can potentially manifest in each point of consciousness where it arises. And each point is absolutely unique. There's never been a human being before like you. Never. Your potentials are absolutely unique. We're not clones. We're not rubber stamps of God. We're recreated each time there's a new human being, and it is we who are doing the creation, and the we that is doing the creation within us is the Christ. Now, why should it be necessary for a new kind of reality to appear at this time? In a way, it's a silly question, because it's the same sort of question as well. Caterpillars are all right. Why do we have to have chrysalises and butterflies? What's the point? Caterpillars are fine. The old joke about the two caterpillars talking to each other on a leaf, and one saying to the other, never get me up in one of those things, as the butterfly flies by. Partly it's a silly question because the nature of reality is growth and expansion. So why there is a new reality, which is blue, coming into our consciousnesses, is an unanswerable question. And at least it's unanswerable from outside in. It's answerable from inside out, because it is we who are creating it. So we are the only beings who know why. But our knowledge of why, it comes from within. It's a demand made by the fact of the waking process. We are awaking into a new reality that we ourselves are creating. If you want to rationalize it a bit further, the reason why there is a new reality being born, dawning in us, is because consciousness is expanding, and there simply isn't room in the existing scenario of realities for that expansion to take place without something new appearing, something new in the way of reality appearing. The material world, in fact, is under pressure. It's under pressure from within. Presence of the whole cosmic ego being, the Christ, within each of our own hearts is itself pressing from within to create a wider, deeper sphere of activity than we have in matter. And we become aware that this entity, this Christ entity, is beginning to put pressure on the material world itself from within. It's entering into the heart space of the actual material world itself, and pressing out from that, expanding its possibilities. There's something in us, in our consciousness, which which has had its chips, as it were, in accepting that material reality dictates the terms of our own consciousness. That's really what it is. We're getting sick and tired of being unable to see through the limitations of matter into realms of reality which are more real than that. And that pressure, which is coming from within our own Christ consciousness, is reaching breaking point. 60, 70, 80 years ago, at the time when the big spiritual movements of that time were appearing, like Theosophy and Rosicrucianism in its new form, and Anthroposophy of Steiner. At that time, it was already coming to the point when thinking was starting to expand and making new demands on our pictures of reality. The path of development which led to big spiritual movements teaching sometimes quite complex paths of understanding began to fade in effectiveness 20 or 30 years ago, because it was expected by the beings in the spiritual world that through those movements enough people would arise in the world to change the climate of thinking away from materialism. Now, it didn't happen, or it didn't happen enough. Thousands of people went into new levels of consciousness and realized that the materialistic picture of the world was losing its way, was becoming inadequate. But it wasn't enough. It didn't actually turn the iceberg over. It didn't make for a climate of thinking throughout the world in which a sufficiently large number of people were aware of new dimensions. The concepts, the life of concepts, the life of ideas of people who began to form the New Age was simply not sufficiently formed. Not enough people had taken new thoughts about the nature of reality on board, so that everything came into the realm of sensation and feeling. And instinctively people went along paths that heightened their own perception rather than thinking. That's why the drug scene started. Because people couldn't get enough pictures. They realized that the pressure of a new reality coming in, but not enough pictures were there. LSD particularly and television, of course. Television is the outer form of LSD, as I've said before. It's really a kind of self-indulgent flooding of the physical perception with more and more and more pictorial content. But you see, it was a false cast, because what was really needed was that entirely new thoughts should have by that time developed to keep that and the sensations in balance in some sort of way. Then there would have been a wide spectrum of openness when new phenomena started to break in. Crop circles and UFOs and things like that broke through into physical reality simply because people had not risen high enough up in their consciousness to see them where they were really happening. But in a certain way, both UFOs and crop circles were pathological phenomena. They were distortions of perceptions that should have been coming at a higher level of perception altogether. We should have been able to rise to the level in which we saw those in the places, in the terms of reference where they were really happening. They're not really happening. The true nature of the crop circles is not happening in physical cornfields. It's happening in the life processes which bring the corn into being itself. That's why in some senses crop circles are a biological phenomenon. They're actually an event in the life of plants. They're something plants are doing. They're an indication that plants too are raising their level of consciousness. whole plant kingdom is on the blink. One aspect of it is that it's fighting back pollution, it's fighting back the overgrowth from too much in the way of fertilizers and that kind of thing. That's one reason why the plant kingdom is fighting back. But it's also a huge restatement of the energy that exists in the entire plant world. It's a very important thing to realize that in the actual world, the actual earth itself, what is called the second coming of the Christ is taking place not in a single human being as it did 2,000 years ago. It's taking place within the actual life force which gives rise to the plants. So now, as new human beings are coming in, on a different level, on the level of the blue consciousness I've referred to once or twice, as new human beings come in, reincarnated from previous lives, the energy that they are coming in on is plant energy. But the change of the way in which this manifestation is happening is so rapid we can hardly keep up with it now. The new beings who will be born will be coming through on a vast wave of plant energy. Something coming straight out of the etheric into the physical manifestation. How one forms pictures of the nature of the life, how we will experience that life in the plant kingdom. It's profitless to guess, because the experiences we shall have will be as new as crop circles were new. I mean, crop circles were new. They'd never happened like that before. Something like it has happened in the Stone Age, which gave rise to similar forms in people's consciousness that caused them to build stone circles and temples. But the actual appearance in nature of forms like that is new. Also, UFOs are partly a plant phenomenon too. They're taking place in the etheric, and some of the UFO forms are plant-like or seed-like in nature. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no physical spaceships. I know there are, but they're, in a sense, they're an aberration. They're coming too far down into material reality when they manifest like that. And they lead to distortions. And they open up paths also for certain planetary beings who haven't got human interests at all at heart to pervert the whole UFO phenomenon into their own purposes. But the healthy aspect, both of UFOs and crop circles, is part of the process of the reanimation of the plant kingdom. We've managed to get 3/4 of the way through the evening without once speaking the word love. That's where things went wrong in Atlantis, when love failed and fear took over, and the tremendous power and skill and insight of the Atlanteans was diverted into paths of power and control. The same thing on another level has happened now, but with the Christ entering into the material, there has opened the possibility of experiencing love in matter, which is the only thing which dissipates fear. The good side of fear is what draws attention to the fact of love entering. You can't actually form pictures in a creative way, fully in a creative way, unless you're at peace. By which we don't mean that you just go back to sleep. It's very difficult for human beings to keep awake. Unless things went wrong, we wouldn't keep awake. There's nothing wrong with things going wrong. Things going wrong is part of, an essential part of the test. The test of becoming human on the earth. Waking is always painful. The waking in the 15th century was intensely painful. The time before Shakespeare was really a time of sleep. Hamlet is the key figure there. The first experience on that level of the fundamental uncertainty of life, right down to the to be or not to be question. Lear wanted to go back to sleep, but all the others were waking into different realms of an entirely new consciousness. Every figure in the Shakespeare plays, the leading figures, were all archetypes for the age we've been living in ever since. We not only have to enter the world of nature now, but we have to let the world of nature in to our own inner space and allow the health of the plant kingdom to operate within our own space. We have to put a kind of inner weight on the spontaneous power of metamorphosis and change and growth. It's so different, isn't it, from this whole picture of the rule of law and the arrival of principles and moral principles, moral certainties. This is right and that is wrong, which leaves no space for growth, no space for realizing how nature, which is also our own inner nature, how that actually works. When Christ is coming into nature, nature becomes safe for the first time, right down into its depths. What about AIDS? What about cancer? What about polio? So on. One has to live within these spaces and create the health from within. We're no longer walking a tightrope between death and life either. We're floating free in a new enlivening of life. Ultimately, we shall discover we don't actually need to die. We don't anyway. The question of living in matter, extending our own being through matter, as the Christ enters matter more and more, expands the possibility of our own consciousness not being dependent on the same cycles, the same rhythms as it's been dependent before. We can block Christ entering the matter that we occupy through fear, through rejection, through taking the resistance too far. We need resistance. We need to fight back in order to gain the strength which ultimately we turn towards the purposes of the gods. The plant between sun and earth. We are rooted, but there's an element in us which floats free. Perhaps that's the butterfly. Perhaps that's where we live in the butterfly as well as in the plant.